Well, I finally did it. I watched The Wheel of Time Season 2. I kept putting it off partly because I was really busy and partly because after Season 1 I was not super enthusiastic about watching Season 2. But fortunately, now that I've watched it, I can say that all of the rumors I heard about it being substantially better than Season 1 in almost every way were well-founded. I felt like the world was bigger and I felt like the lore and the magic system was better fleshed out. But today I want to look more specifically at this question of, did Season 2, with all of the good things it did, actually solve the problems that Season 1 introduced? And or is it possible to even solve all of those problems? For the most part, I have really positive things to say about Season 2. But I think this question of, will the show ever live up to the books? Will it ever give us the full story that we all know and love from the books on screen is an interesting one, because there are some severe limitations with the format in which the series is choosing to adapt the books, and it's anyone's guess whether the show will actually overcome these. Anyway, welcome to Generic Entertainment. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. Also, there will be spoilers ahead for both seasons of the show, as well as the Wheel of Time books up to around book 3. Although I might be mentioning stuff from later books occasionally because the show kind of mixes and matches what it includes from which books, and it's all a bit iffy. So what were the problems with Season 1 of The Wheel of Time? Obviously one of the big ones were the production difficulties due to COVID and due to Barney Harris, one of the main actors, leaving halfway through the season. And Season 2 obviously does better on this front because, thank the light, we didn't have any of those problems this time around. But if I had to boil down my main problem with Season 1 of the show into a word, I think it would be editing, both on the small scale and on the big scale. On the small scale, individual scenes in the show don't give us a very good sense of place. We have all these fantastic, beautiful sets that were built for the show and all these amazing costumes, but the way it's all edited together feels very choppy. We're oftentimes very close up to actors' faces. We don't get a whole lot of long shots, and we don't get a lot of tracking shots either, so we don't get to see the camera sort of move through space and give us a real sense of location. And I think all of this contributes to a feeling of distance. But on a macro level, there's also a lot of editing difficulties with what they chose to put in and what they chose to take out. We have character arcs that go nowhere, a lot of focus on side characters as opposed to the main characters. And the result is, in Season 1, it feels like we're just sort of grazing the surface of a really interesting and in-depth world, but we never really get to go deep into it. One of the things that seems worth mentioning on this front, though, is that a lot of these problems are reflected in the books themselves in one way or another. For example, the focus on side characters at the expense of the main characters wasn't really a problem in the early books, but in the later books, hoo boy, it was a really big issue. You had entire books where Rand or Egwene or Mat just completely disappeared, and you were left wondering if they were even alive in some cases for entire books. Regarding Mat and Perrin specifically, which many people say are still very underdeveloped at the end of Season 2 in the show, in the books, these characters didn't really have much to do early on. Mat was just extremely annoying in Book 2, and Perrin didn't really have much of a character arc early on either. The problem is that what the show does to address these two particular characters' character arcs doesn't work. Much has been said about the choice of fridging Perrin's wife and then not really doing anything with that for the rest of the season, or in Season 2 for that matter. But with Mat, we also see the same problem. His whole character arc in the show is about how he doesn't want to be like his father, which is a real shame because Abel Cawthon was a very beloved character from the books, but that's besides the point. I think that this choice actually does make sense, because Mat's struggle early on in the books is about this dagger from Shadar Logoth that he picks up, and by adding in this subplot about him not wanting to be like his father, we sort of have the dagger represents like the more evil half of himself, the more irresponsible half of himself that he wants to disregard, and him throwing away the dagger is sort of symbolic of him trying to become a better person. It makes sense on paper. The problem is that the show doesn't commit to it. Abel Cawthon is barely even a character in the show. He gets like a couple scenes, he's completely forgettable. And so every time this whole plot line about Mat not wanting to be like his father is brought up, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a thing. I wonder if they're ever going to do anything with that. Then of course there's the very confusing and lore-breaking ending of Season 1, which was bad, but the ending of Book 1 was also very bad on this front. I hate the ending of Book 1, and I personally don't think the show is too much worse. And so if a lot of season 1's problems were reflected in the books as well, you might ask, why did I not enjoy season 1 nearly as much as I enjoyed book 1 of the series? And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that after the, for me, rather disappointing ending of book 1, The Eye of the World, I was able to just immediately pick up The Great Hunt and continue reading, with the knowledge that everybody says the series gets better after the first few books, and so I had that to look forward to. With the show, I really have no idea if it's going to get good in the future. I have no idea if the quality is going to pick up, and so I was left going out of season 1 feeling kind of frustrated. But I think more importantly, the reason I didn't really enjoy season 1 that much is because it's just not nearly as immersive as the books. The Eye of the World is not the greatest fantasy book ever written by any means, but it's a real page-turner of a story nonetheless. Even when you don't know that much about the characters, the danger feels real, and so you care about them. I think the best illustration of this is Mat and Rand's journey to Camelin in the books compared to their journey to Tar Valon in the show. This was my favorite section of The Eye of the World, just because of how incredibly focused it was and how it placed you for several chapters at a time in the perspective of these characters who were just constantly on the run, always in danger, always looking out for the next thing trying to kill them. When you compare that to the show, a lot of the tension is gone because this section is just so much shorter. It's barely even there. It feels sort of like a series of isolated incidents rather than a long journey, and it's just a lot less satisfying to experience. So that's season 1. The question I'm trying to answer in this video is, did season 2 solve all of these problems? And the answer, I guess, is ish, sort of, sometimes, maybe. I first want to say that I enjoyed pretty much everything about season 2. Now, when I was watching season 1 for the first time, I also enjoyed most of it. I enjoyed most of the scenes, and it was only after finishing the season that it started to hit me that this wasn't really that great of an adaptation. But with season 2, I felt like I genuinely did have a more satisfying experience. The world feels richer, and there are so many little nuggets that are put in there for book fans specifically to pick up on. Even just in the first episode, there were many times where I was like, yes! Finally, we're finally addressing this thing that was completely neglected in season 1. An example is the 5 powers, the 5 different types of weaves that an Aes Sedai can use. In season 1, this wasn't even really addressed, but in the first episode of season 2, we have a scene where Egwene and Nynaeve are training to use these different powers in different ways in order to accomplish something other than just throwing fireballs, which is pretty cool. The casting also just continues to impress. I think every main character who was introduced this season was cast pretty much perfectly. Elaine has this wonderful poutiness to her, but also this strength, which is so perfect. Her overall vibe sort of reminds me of Elizabeth Swann from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, although maybe that's also just because they're both extremely British. Lanfear, I don't even know if I need to mention Lanfear because I think everybody sort of collectively agrees that the casting for Lanfear is spot on. She is phenomenal. I also noticed how her actress being notably older than Yosha Stradowski, who plays Rand, makes her relationship with him feel maybe slightly more predatory. Like in the books, when Rand first meets her, she's sort of playing the role of a damsel in distress. She's pretending to be all frail and helpless, and he rushes in and saves her from, I think, a Grom or one of those creatures. Whereas in the show, she's like his landlord or something. It's very clear that she is like in a position of power in their relationship. And I think that's perfect for setting her up as, you know, Lanfear. I love what they're doing with Varen. She's more noticeably sagacious than she is in the books, but people who have read the books know that there is always a lot more to Varen than meets the eye, and I think it's good that they're making it clear that there are many layers to this character, that she's not just some absent-minded buffoon, the way she sometimes appears earlier on in the books. Regarding the pacing, the episodes in this season are longer than in season 1, which is good, but they're still not long enough, and there is still not enough of them, which is a huge issue. Those of you who have been watching my channel for a while might remember that earlier this year, I did a review of another adaptation of a book series, Three Body, or The Three Body Problem. And season 1 of that show got 30 episodes to adapt one 400-page book, which was way too many episodes, and the pacing of the show definitely suffered for it. But it's interesting nonetheless to compare that to this, where we have 2 800-page books being crammed into one 8-episode season. I would much rather take the slow pacing of the 30-episode season that gives us a chance to sit with characters more and just like get to know them, get to experience their lives even when it's somewhat mundane, as opposed to this extremely rushed season. Nonetheless, the world genuinely does feel more real this season. It certainly helps that we spend longer in a lot of the locations we go to. There's something like 7 episodes in the season 2 set in Cairhien, which really helps give Cairhien a sort of unique identity. And I think the interior sets of Cairhien, especially Oliver's home, was really well done. But despite all of these improvements, there's still something about the show that feels a little bit off, that prevents me from being fully invested in it. And I know it's not just me, because a lot of people have been saying the same thing. But the thing is, I can't quite gesture at what it is. It's true that there are many individual scenes in this series that don't make a whole lot of sense and that break immersion quite a bit. For example, there's the scene where Moiraine just slices Lanfear's throat like it's nothing and leaves her there to bleed out, which doesn't seem like something she would do in the books to one of the literal Forsaken. Also, it's a little hard to believe that Lanfear wouldn't notice Moiraine sneaking up on her. Even if she couldn't sense her ability to channel as a result of her being shielded by Ishamael, you would think she would be observant enough to notice an Aes Sedai barging into her house with a knife. Then there's another scene with Lanfear and Moiraine where she pushes Moiraine and Lan out of a waygate near Falme and just kind of leaves them there. And my immediate question in that scene was, why didn't Moiraine just reopen up the waygate and go right back inside? Like, she has the ability to channel, so I'm not sure why she wouldn't do that. I feel like there's something I'm missing in that scene, but it just wasn't really very well explained. There's Ingtar's death scene in episode 8, which is just not very well done. I don't think anybody who hadn't read the books would have any idea about the significance of this character. And it was almost comedic, partly because my brain has been so destroyed by watching so many TV shows and movies that whenever I hear the line, "You go ahead and I'll hold them off," I just can't help but burst out laughing because it's such a joke at this point. It's such a cliche. And it's especially frustrating because the rest of them didn't go on. They just kind of stood there watching while Ingtar died valiantly, accomplishing nothing, and then they ran away. What was the point of that? I really hate when character deaths are just meaningless and don't make you feel anything. And yeah, that one took the cake on that front. Also in episode 8 was probably the most unintentionally funny scene of this entire show so far, which is this scene where these Seanchan guards are standing outside of the gates of Falme watching this massive cloud of mist, and suddenly a massive cavalry charge of White Cloaks emerges from the dust and just like stampedes into the city. This is an example of a thing that a lot of fantasy shows and movies do, where the writers try to come up with some really unique and visually interesting tactic that is supposed to be really clever, but just makes no sense. We're clearly supposed to think that the White Cloaks are really clever for hiding inside this massive cloud of dust while approaching the city, but aside from how they managed to get that massive cloud of dust there in the first place, there's also the issue of the fact that horses make a lot of noise. Like in this scene, the guards don't hear the horses until they're visible, and it's just like, why? Why don't they hear a massive army that's charging toward them? Like, that should sound like a thunderclap. Not to mention the fact that the White Cloaks have been camped like right next to the city for at least one day, and there is no way the Seanchan don't have scouts. So how on earth is this a surprise attack? The show desperately wants you to think that this is some clever surprise attack on the part of the White Cloaks, but it just isn't. There is no way this makes sense in real life. The reason I found this scene so funny, though, is because it reminded me of the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where Lancelot is running towards this castle and these two guards just stand there staring at him until he's like right up in front of them and he stabs them. But that scene is supposed to be funny, and this scene isn't. And that's a problem. I don't think these minor issues are the sorts of things that make and break TV shows, though. I think that there are some bigger issues with the show that are a lot harder to gesture at, but which form a sort of overarching theme. I think one of the main issues, broadly speaking, is that the show is sort of scared of itself, and it's scared of its source material. The Wheel of Time has a lot of weird elements that are sort of just glossed over in the show in the effort to make it look more like a normal fantasy world. Like the portal stones, we see a portal stone once, but we don't really get to see what they do. We don't get to see the parallel universes. We don't get to see the Grolm and all the other weird creatures, although that might be a CGI budget issue, but still. And the writers overall just haven't done a very good job of illustrating what makes channeling as a magic system unique. It sort of just feels vague, like the characters are kind of waving their hands around and you see all these cool lines of light, but you don't often have a good idea of what they're doing. Again, as I said earlier, it is better than in season 1, but it still feels kind of wishy-washy, and it's especially a problem when the show contradicts the mechanics that it introduced earlier, as in the scene with the ADOM. I also just want to say, because I haven't heard it mentioned anywhere else, that I really hate the sound design for channeling. I've noticed a trend in a lot of movies and TV shows recently where the sound design for all of the magical mechanics has become this really sibilant grating noise that sounds like, and it just gets on my nerves. I think the origin of this is Marvel movies. Like, every Marvel sound effect sounds like that. It just sounds like this sound, and that's exactly what channeling sounds like in the show. And it just feels like the most uninspired choice they could have made for the sound effects. One thing they did absolutely knock it out of the park, though, is the costumes and the set design, which continues to be so amazing. The designs for the Shan-Chan soldiers are just perfect. But related to the issues of making everything feel sort of generic, I think a large part of the problem with this show is the fact that it's just a little bit afraid to let viewers live in the moment. The editing continues to be very fast-paced. Shots continue to be mostly close-ups or Dutch angle long shots or other cliche-looking shots like that. And the result of all this is that a lot of locations start to feel sort of the same. And as much as I hate to say it, because I genuinely do love the soundtrack and I just love to listen to it on my own time, I think it's a fantastic soundtrack on its own. In the show itself and for the scenes it's in, it doesn't always work, because a lot of the main themes for the show have such a similar orchestration that they all just sort of blur into one another. And so the result is that all of these characters and locations start to blur into one another as well. At the level of audio, there's really not much of a distinction between a scene set in Falme and a scene set in Tar Valon. And I think that's a bit of an issue because sound is super important. It's a really important part of immersing you in the world. Compare it to something like Lord of the Rings, which I realize is a bit unfair because the soundtrack for Lord of the Rings is like one of the best soundtracks in any movie ever. But whatever. For the scenes that are set in the Shire, the music just sounds on every level so completely different from the music in scenes set in Gondor or in Isengard. And so your brain just starts to pick up on these like subliminal audio differences between places. The Wheel of Time struggles with it. It struggles to make the series immersive on like an audio-visual level. So now we're getting onto the part of the review where I want to give my overall thoughts about this season. I really want to say that this show is primed for success, that it has all the ingredients it needs to become a genuinely fantastic show in season 3 and going forward. And there certainly have been major improvements, but there are still some issues that are just holding it back, and these are things I don't really see changing going forward. Issues with character arcs and pacing and things like that can be solved. But the issue of not having enough episodes in a season to really tell the story that you want to tell, and the issue of committing yourself to a style of editing and a sound design that just isn't very immersive or not as immersive as it could be, those are issues that are going to be a lot harder to fix. They could still be fixed, but they're sort of set in place now. The issue of the number of the episodes in a season is definitely a huge one. I don't see that many shows that get more episodes in future seasons than they do in initial seasons. And we already know season 3 is going to be 8 episodes, I believe, so I don't really see this changing going forward. When I look at the future of this show, I find it really hard to imagine adapting the last battle in a way that won't feel anticlimactic. And that's a problem because the last battle, as I discussed in a recent video on my channel, is really what makes the entire Wheel of Time series work. It's the culmination of everything that went on before, and if that final sequence wasn't satisfying, then the whole series would have just felt like a waste. It's hard to imagine the last battle in the show really having enough setup for all these dramatic character moments and all these big revelations. Also, there's the issue that the battle scenes in this show continue to be the worst scenes in the show. There's just so much boring and generic action. But I nonetheless remain hopeful, if only because I really enjoyed this season, and if future seasons can at least maintain this level of quality, then the show as a whole may not be a masterpiece, but I am really gonna enjoy it. And so because I like to end on a positive note, I just want to mention a few of my favorite moments in this season because there were so many moments that just gave me such a burst of joy as a fan of the books. Hopper's introduction and his death scene were huge standouts for me. His death scene was the only scene in this entire season that made me shed tears, and for good reason. The way that they chose to introduce Hopper's name was just so brilliant, and I think that choice alone justifies this entire adaptation. Just like having Perrin see this wolf in a vision jumping up into the air so joyfully, it brought a smile to my face and then tears to my eyes when he died. even though I already knew it was going to happen. I love the scene where Elaine meets Rand for the first time, and I love that she is the one who heals his wound, because that's exactly how they met in the books. Even though they met in a totally different time and place, and even though she didn't use the one power to heal him, she still helped heal him from a wound when he accidentally fell into her garden. And so it's a nice little callback to the way their relationship initially began. Even though I'm not a huge fan of their relationship in the books, I think it was a nice moment. So I've criticized the fight scenes in this show, but the scene where Aviendha fights the White Cloaks gave me goosebumps all over my body. The music that Lorne Balfe, the composer, made for the Aiel is just so good. Ugh, that scene was amazing. When Mat said his iconic line after blowing the Horn of Valere, I literally lost control of my entire body. Like, I am not the type of person to be a fanboy or anything like that. I thought I was past this, but when he said that line, "Dovieyande se Tavia Sagen," I could not handle myself. I was just like, you know, throwing my hands up in the air and pumping my fists and gasping and crying and weeping and vomiting all over the floor. It was amazing. Everything with Egwene this season was just absolutely phenomenal. I know that's not a hot take, but still I have to say it. Madeline Madden's acting was incredible during the Adom scenes, and I love the actor they got for Rhenna. They're just so incredibly threatening, but they also really captured the way that the Sul'dam genuinely care for their damane and the way that you might care for a pet. It's so much more perverse and complicated than a typical slave-master relationship, and I'm really glad that the writers understood that and made it clear in the show. Then the scene where Egwene fights Ishamael, sure, you can say, like, it doesn't make any sense, she shouldn't be able to take on any of the Forsaken. I say, shut up, it was awesome. Also, I think you can totally rationalize this as Ishamael was just testing her. I don't think he would actually want to kill Egwene, since he's still trying to convince Rand to join the Dark at this point, and killing Egwene doesn't seem like a good way to do that. But either way, the way she just, like, walks up and, you know, like, pushes her dress behind her and just, like, stares him down, it's awesome. It's so Egwene. I love the scene where Lanfear just, like, casually executes that guy, just, like, blows his head apart by snapping her fingers or whatever. That was awesome. Dane Bornhold was surprisingly great. The actor they got for him was, like, fantastic in the few scenes that he got. And the setup for him hating Perrin was, like, actually good. In the books, this was one of the most infuriatingly long-winded and boring plot lines, but in the show, it seems like there's actually a setup for a pretty good future confrontation between Dane and Perrin. And I'm excited to see more of it going forward. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I'm excited to see more of Dane Bornhold. I also love how much more complicated Ishamael is in the show than in the books. In the books, he's sort of a raving lunatic, and at first, I'll admit, when I saw Faris Faris in the last episode of Season 1, I was a little bit skeptical about the casting because he was playing Ishamael in such a different way. He was so much more cold and calculating. But in Season 2, it really is obvious what they're doing. They're trying to bring Moradin more into Ishamael. They're trying to bring this person who is obsessed with destroying reality, with breaking the wheel, with achieving a escape from the endless cycle of death and rebirth in which he's trapped. And I think that makes him so much more compelling as a character, and I'm glad they included it in this season. The Texas accents on the Seanchan. I cannot believe they actually committed to having the Seanchan have Texas accents. It's like one of my favorite obscure lore details from the books, and now it's in the show for everybody to see and hear. Granted, they're not the most thick Texas accents ever, but the Seanchan, a lot of them at least, clearly do have like a southern twang, and it's amazing. I love it so much. And finally, the last thing I want to mention, although there are many more things I can mention, is Moghedien, who is just so perfect. The casting for this character, I'm so excited to see more of her in future seasons, and especially to see her go up against Nynaeve. This actress, in the one scene she gets, is just so entertaining. So ever since finishing watching the show and my time browsing internet forums and reading other people's reactions to this season, I saw a comment somewhere where somebody said, this show could turn into a reverse Game of Thrones. I can't remember where I saw this posted, so sorry I can't credit it, but I think this is such a great sentiment and I wanted to share it here. This show can be a reverse Game of Thrones. You can just have a really, really bad first season, a better second season, but still some serious issues, and then seasons that just progressively get better until like the last season is genuinely phenomenal. Let's do that. I think that's the kind of positivity we need going forward with this show. Let's do a reverse Game of Thrones. All right, that's about all I want to say about The Wheel of Time Season 2, although there are many more things I could say. If you want to chat more about it, I recently started a Discord server, which you can check out on the community tab on my channel. There's already a lot of discussion about The Wheel of Time happening in there, along with the Cosmere and a bunch of other fantasy series and sci-fi series that I cover on this channel. So feel free to join if you want to check that out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, as always. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed this and subscribe to the channel. And yeah, until next time, stay generic.